Good evening. It's just after 6:30. Welcome to this, the latest View from the Bridge, a series of conversations we're having with senior leaders across the Naval Service, Royal Navy and Royal Marines, on behalf of the Royal Navy and Royal Marines charity, the RNRMC. I'm Stephen Watson. I'm a Vice President of the charity, and with me this evening we have a very, very special guest. We have the second Sea Lord and Principal Personnel Officer, I think correct technical term, Vice Admiral Martin Connell. Martin, you're very welcome, and thank you for agreeing to do this. A number of your senior colleagues have been in this chair in the studio we have here in central London before, including the current First Sea Lord. We had your colleague, the Fleet Commander, Vice Admiral Andy Burns, with us a few months back. So we're thrilled to have you here for the next hour or so. The format is going to be, I think most of you are pretty familiar with how we do it. We'll keep it fairly relaxed and conversational. I'll monopolise Martin for 20 minutes or so and have a chat about some of the pertinent issues that he and his team are addressing. But this is a two-way conversation, so there is an opportunity for you to ask questions as well. And the simple way to do that is to use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Those questions will come in just in the order that they're received. There's no sort of system of filtering or monitoring. They come onto an iPad here, and if you are content, I'll put those questions directly to the Admiral and be able to share his answers with you. Just before we start, a short plug for, well, it can be a long plug actually, it's deserving, for the charity, the Royal Navy, Royal Marines charity. The work that they do is really quite extraordinary, and I was privileged to sit as a trustee for 5 or 6 years on the board and have kept in touch with the charity as a VP. I'm going to ask the Admiral how important, and for him to share a sort of service side view of how important the work of the charity is for the serving community. But for veterans and families, the work that the charity does is amazing. All of you, I think, watching today have a connection. And we originally started these series of conversations for the Nelson's Company, which, if you're not already a member, that is the closest thing you can do to becoming part of the RNRMC club. So look it up. I'm sure it's on the website, and sign up if you can. But Martin, thank you for being here. I mean, you've had a stellar career in the Naval Service. I mean, you've flown helicopters, you've commanded aircraft carriers, HMS Illustrious. You also have a very interesting stateside perspective. You were the naval attaché in Washington. I think that's when we first met back in 2019. But of course now, as second Sea Lord, you have a host of responsibilities. It's a job you started 6 months ago. How's it going? It's June.
Well, thanks, Stephen. It's great to be here, and I recognise I'm the last of the senior team to be sat in this seat, so I hope to be able to fill in some of the gaps that perhaps they couldn't cover. Yeah, it's nearly 6 months since I took over, and goodness me, that time has flown by. There's an enormous amount on right now. So there's no shortage of issues for me to get to grips with, and I think that is, for any senior leadership position, it's trying to manage what the crisis of the day is set against the longer term issues. And I suppose where I differ from my colleague, the Fleet Commander, Vice Admiral Andy Burns, is he's responsible for operations today, and indeed making sure that all forces are prepared for operations tomorrow. I'm thinking about the day after tomorrow. I'm thinking about the Navy of next decade. And of course I need to give him the wherewithal to do everything he needs today. But I'm really balancing my time much more now on making sure that we can have the strategic patience to think through what the Royal Navy of the 2030s needs to be like.
So when first gave you the keys to the second Sea Lord locker, you opened it. Has anything surprised you? Is it as you expected to find? Or are there some immediate things that you've had to focus on?
There weren't too many surprises because my last role as the Navy's Force Generation Director was in the Navy headquarters. And if you think of Navy transformation, I had the lead for 3 of the 6 lines of development within Navy transformation. So on one level, it was about moving office 40 meters away. So I could pick up fairly quickly some of those themes. But on another level, my responsibilities have shifted. You mentioned earlier on, Principal Personnel Officer for the Royal Navy. That's an incredibly important function that I fulfill. Now, up until now, I've not had HR jobs or personnel jobs specifically, but I'm really pleased that we can and are reflecting the importance of people within our new strategy. That was something, I think, that perhaps because of COVID, perhaps because of other distractions and an integrated review, we didn't focus on that as much as I think we should have done. So I'm spending quite a bit of time with my colleagues working through exactly what that means.
Now, I mean, you mentioned transformation.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say that your predecessor and the previous leadership team majored on transformation. We hear a lot less about that now. I mean, does that mean that era has sort of passed? Or is this transformation light or transformation different?
I think if you're in a constant state of we're always transforming, then perhaps you might lose sight of what's really important. My predecessor, but one, is now the Chief of Defence Staff. So he has an absolute interest in what we're doing, and he visited the Navy headquarters, and indeed he's visited all of the frontline commands over the last few weeks. And he was keen to know that we hadn't just put to one side all of the initiatives that he was very passionate about, and we haven't, of course. If you take all the various strands of Navy transformation from a year ago, we are doubling down on those. So improving availability is no less important today than it was last year, and it will continue to be an issue all the way through this decade. We need to make sure that every pound that flows to the Royal Navy is spent wisely. And I think all of us would acknowledge that there's more we can do to get better availability out of our ships, submarines, and air squadrons. And so that will continue. If you think of carrier strike, we achieved fantastic milestone a year or so ago, but we're still only at an initial operating capability. And the worst thing we could do is just bump along, and that's our ambition. Far from it. When we get to full operating capability, it doesn't stop there either. We've got to make sure that for the decades that are ahead of us, those aircraft carriers are properly global and properly embracing new technologies. But what I'm focusing now on is how we can make sure that the investments that are being given to the Royal Navy are spent wisely. And that's about behind the scenes activity, working with our industry partners to make sure that the money is spent on the things we care about, and that the schedule doesn't come as a surprise to us, and we're then standing on the naughty step outside ministers' offices. So I'm doing a lot of that behind the scenes activity to make sure that the Navy's constantly modernising and transforming where we need to. And indeed, this decade will see all sorts of capabilities shift. I think, and First Sea Lord's spoken about this a fair bit, I think this is certainly the biggest recapitalisation in a generation. Arguably, in 70 years it is. But that's not going to happen just by accident. That's not just about steel ships being passed across the Royal Navy and a white ensign raised and then everything's fine. It's about a fundamental shift in how we think. It's about leveraging off the new technologies that are available to us. It's about a different way of operating and thinking as a Navy. And that, to me, is what transformation offers.
I mean, I think I heard first when he went to Scotland to deliver his first sort of keynote speech. I mean, he talked a lot about delivery. And I think obviously you and First and Fleet feel that responsibility is sitting very much on your shoulders. But when it comes to that mindset, I mean, if we were having this conversation, in a wardroom or a mess deck, how do you get that message through to the front line? And what are you looking for your people to do differently, think differently, that gets onto that swim lane?
So we've thought a lot about this. We are in the delivery phase. So the focus, I think, of the previous senior leadership team was about preparing for and getting a good outcome from the integrated review. We're now in the delivery years of the traditional spending review period. But that doesn't mean we're just focused solely on the here and now, making sure pounds are spent properly. It's about having the ambition, I think, through what we want of the Navy of the future. We realise as a senior team that the best decisions are not made round a table with the executive committee of the Royal Navy. What we want to do is unlock the fantastic, innovative thoughts and ideas that our people have. We do have genuinely brilliant people, but occasionally we tend to stifle some of those ideas and thinking, and that really puts people off. So how can we unlock the best ideas in a different way? And there are different sorts of forum that we have in play now. And
does that really work, Martin? I mean, I could talk to any chief executive or leader of business that will say, they sit in that chair and they'll say, yeah, it's all about people, it's about unlocking ideas, it's the ethos of innovation, all of these things. But there are such legacy structures across the naval service, and people sit in their silos. I mean, can you really create that sort of cross-fertilization and do the best float to the top?
I'm certainly trying to.
You're trying.
If you think some of the best freedoms our people have is when they're in command of units, whether that's a commando or indeed a ship. Yet they reflect in further jobs that they have less authority to make decisions. That can't be right. So what we are doing, we are developing an integrated plan. If you think of this as a decade of transitions, and it is, they won't happen by chance. So what we have to do is put in place the rigour so that those milestones, and there are thousands, literally thousands of milestones this decade, we've got to have a degree of discipline over understanding as a senior team what milestones matter and what decisions we've got to take at the right time. At the same time as that, what we've got to do is delegate decisions further down the organisation. Now, others will have said that before, I'm sure, but we're turning that into action. So I want more freedoms for COs of shore establishments than have ever been in place before. Now, what we might have to do is just calibrate that as we go along, but they'll have more responsibility for the workforce that's around them. They'll have more budgetary responsibility than they've had before, and they'll have freedoms to act in a quicker way. And where they can't act, they're to elevate that to the senior team for us to try and help them.
I mean, I appreciate you're only 6 months in, but nowadays nobody has very much time, so you're already having to account for what you're doing and sort of measure progress. 2 questions. I gather you've got an Admiralty board next week, so that is a moment where you're face to face with our political masters. What is your sort of 6-month scorecard that you will share at the Admiralty board? And then if you were to think of this in terms of your legacy or the legacy of the current leadership team, what would you want that legacy to be 2 to 3 years from now?
So I want the Navy to be more available, more deployable and more lethal in the future. That's what I want to leave behind. I think that's what the first Seaborne Fleet Commander want as well. But specifically for the portfolio I have, it's got to be more available. We want more ships. We want more systems. We need to be a modular Navy in the future. We need to embrace autonomy. And we need to be more lethal. So we're going to tell that story at the Admiralty Board next week. Ministers' time's precious. So when we bring those ministers together, we want them to go away feeling that the Navy has an ambitious plan, but it's a deliverable plan. It isn't one that's just fully conceptual, that's got no substance behind it. You're seeing frigates being built. We've got competitions in play. We're being bold and imaginative about how we can speed up the pace of acquisition. But of course, some capital programs like the Dreadnought program, we want that confidence in delivery. That's really important to us because we've got to carry on delivering the Vanguard class while we're bringing the Dreadnought class online. So no surprises, we need to do that. But for new technologies, goodness me, we've got to do things in a different way. And I'm pretty determined we can do that. And we're going to show some examples next week of how we think we can do that.
So, I mean, it just might be that there's some ministers watching this tonight, Excellent. So you can sort of socialise them
Every day's
to
an
what's
agile
coming.
day, Stephen.
Have you got enough people and enough money to do what you need to do?
Well, our budget's growing. That's really good news. And I think that shows the confidence within where the Navy sits within defence. We have bid for extra funding recently, and that's gone down quite well, and I'm pleased about that. We've got to have the capacity to spend it, though. And that's a requirement for us to work with our delivery agents even closer than we've worked before. principally the DNS and the Submarine Delivery Agency, but there are others. So we've got to work on a one-team approach. In terms of the people, we're a growing Navy. I try to look at things as the PPO, as a whole force perspective, because it's about the Royal Navy and Royal Marines that we have in regular service, but it's also obviously about those who are our reservists, as well as the civilians, and in particular civil servants that work with us. And then we've got to work across an enterprise with our industry partners. So I think we've got enough people for what we need to do today, but we're growing. So we need to get, and it's not just about numbers as well. I mean, this is pretty obvious, but we're competing in a really competitive field right now.
Well, and the labour market is tightening all of the time.
It is.
I mean, how confident are you that we've got that pipeline, that there is, the lived experience matches the promise, that, translates to more people coming in? I mean, you have a recruit, retain and nurture strategy.
Yeah.
Does that stack up?
Well, first of all, the backdrop, you're right. It's a really challenging employment position we're in. The country is pretty much at full employment. Economic conditions are challenging, and the demand for competition and talent is really high. So the Royal Navy offer's got to be compelling. And I think that offer does give people something that certainly the private sector can't replicate. There's a shortage of engineers nationally. Now, if it's strictly about which company can compete to pay the most, we're not going to be top of that list. But if it's about giving engineers a truly global experience, working in demanding operations with fantastic people around them that will have stories for life, then yes, I think that offer is quite exciting. And the evidence is the number of people who are applying to join is up. The number of people who are joining is up. That means we've got a bit more choice about the people we choose. But it's going to be really tricky for a service like ours, where about half of the people in the Navy, give or take, are technicians. We've got to be able to take people with the minimum of qualifications and then upskill them so that they can very quickly get additional qualifications. And then, when they do leave, I'm delighted that we've turned them back into society with skills that they didn't have before they joined.
Has the Top Gun film helped?
It always helps. Come on, have you seen it? It's.
I have seen it. Yeah.
I think if you can suspend reality for a couple of hours, it's a brilliant film. And I was chatting to a couple of my US Navy colleagues. There was a real bounce in recruitment in the late 80s. That wasn't just for the US Navy. Many other navies had a bounce in recruitment. So we're hoping that there'll be lots of interest that will play off this one.
Yeah, I mean, clearly I know you're quite keen that the Fleet Air Arm is a beneficiary of this, but I mean, more broadly, just the understanding and the visibility of what the maritime component of defence looks like, and actually what that translates to in terms of careers and opportunities. I mean, it always used to be said, the Navy's it's over the horizon, it's out of sight, it's out of mind. I sense that has changed, and that's partly the success of things like CSG last year and just what the carriers mean. But is there a sort of generational change, do you think, in terms of the people that you're able to attract and bring into the service?
I think there's a gradually improving understanding of what the Royal Navy does for the United Kingdom. It was about a decade or so ago, you'll probably recall, there was this discussion about sea blindness, relevance. Perhaps that was in part due to the campaign in Afghanistan, among other things. But now, as you say, that we've got two fantastic new flagships, the largest ships the Royal Navy's ever had. And the first operational deployment was a remarkable success. We exceeded our operational milestones that we set ourselves. On the back of another great series for the Commandos, people have a great understanding what our Royal Marines do, at and from the sea, but also in harsh conditions in the high north. And that series, I thought, brought that out really brilliantly. So I think there is a growing understanding of what the Royal Navy does for the UK, not just around these shores, not just in the North Atlantic, but further afield as well.
Let's return to ambition. And and perhaps the integrated review. I mean, basically the direction of travel. I mean, the Prime Minister has said or tasked you with being the foremost navy in Europe. I think we all enjoyed hearing those words. I think more of us are slightly confused as to what that means in practice. I mean, I'm hoping you're really clear about what being the foremost navy in Europe actually entails.
Well, it's not about some top trump style of tonnage or, miles covered in a year. It's really about our ability to offer credible defence options to the government of the day. And if you think of what we do both, beneath the waves, above the waves, with our Royal Marines, and we can do so in a global way, in harsh conditions as well, there aren't many other navies that can match that. But it's not about a simple competition. We've got to be, I think, a navy that's a reference navy for other navies to look up to. And that can be on thought leadership, the way we're operating and thinking. It can be about capabilities, the way we're willing to take some technical risk, embracing new systems. Perhaps we may not succeed in all of them, but it shows a navy that's willing to embrace those new technologies, and that's a nod to our past. I think we've always sort of pioneered new technologies as quickly as we can, and we certainly aim to do that this decade. So that, to me, is what being the foremost navy in Europe is, and we are one of the reference navies within NATO, so it's important we have the ability to lead as well, and lead very quickly and give options to NATO and indeed our own government in terms of how, when any crisis emerges, we've got the wherewithal. And if you take this year, we have a 2-star Mike Utley, him and his staff are a readiness for any operation. We've tested that. That's attributed to NATO, as indeed are our aircraft carriers. I think if you put all that together, that's what a foremost navy in Europe sounds like.
I mean, I think also it partly needs to be viewed through the lens of how our allies and adversaries see it. I mean, I'd be interested for your view on how you think the Russians and those that might want to do our interests down see it. But you also have a perspective from Washington. You were naval attaché during a critical period. I mean, you've spent a huge amount of time in the US. I mean, what's the bottom line? I mean, did the US really view us as the foremost navy in Europe? Are we that dependable ally at the top of our game?
I think we have to be. And you're right. I mean, I'm an unashamed Atlanticist. I've done a number of courses in the United States. I've lived in the United States. I've been an attaché as well. I care about that relationship, and it goes back decades. It is strategic. It is not something that just comes and goes with any administration. If you look at the nuclear technology agreements that were made, if you look at the Polaris sales agreement, we still exercise those today, and we will do for the next generation, both Dreadnought and Columbia class on the US side. So this is decades, it's strategic, and certainly from a Navy to Navy perspective, I know they value what we bring, because from a war-fighting perspective, we will fight alongside the United States and within NATO. And I think if you are outside of NATO, let's say perhaps Russia, looking at that, they're scratching around for allies right now. And they look at us, and yes, it would be very easy to say the Royal Navy in isolation, but the Royal Navy will fight alongside the United States and with our NATO allies. And that's a really quite impressive capability that we can bring to bear. So those alliances that were writ large in the integrated review, absolutely reinforced now. And many of our programs, there's a United States dependency. I think it's for us, though, to be a dependable partner as well. We need to be predictable. We need to be not just interoperable. You'll have heard many others say what's beyond interoperability is interchangeability, where there's an absolute confidence that a capability that we can provide can slot in to, let's say, a United States strike group. We test that often. We think about it. That's an important benchmark. We now have our own sovereign strike group, and we were very open to the fact that the inaugural deployment we had, United States, both Navy and Marine Corps, interchangeable and integrated within our capability. There aren't many other navies that have that confidence and trust to be able to do that.
Okay. Questions are starting to come in. Keen to take those. But let me just ask you about future capabilities. I mean, that very much is one of the things that you're responsible for. We're in an era of massive technology change, and there's something of an arms race, whether it's hypersonic or autonomous. Presumably, we simply don't have the wherewithal and the resources and, frankly, the money to be able to chase all of those technologies. So some difficult choices and priorities are going to have to be made. That sort of falls to you and your generation of leaders. How are we making that call? And how are we going to be confident that, whether we decide we're going to have rail guns or, move to drones or whatever it might be, that we get that right?
So I think it is a really exciting time. If you're designing a future Navy, this is a really exciting time to be doing that. And I suppose if you're looking at a balanced scorecard for what a second Sea Lord can bring, you probably won't know how successful we are until a few years down the track. But let's take our Commando forces. We have some brilliant Marines. Their ability to operate in harsh conditions is without question. But I think our thinking on how we did amphibious operations and indeed some of the platforms were indeed legacy, and they didn't quite reflect that lived experience of the technologies you describe. So the future Commando force isn't something that we want to design for the mid-2030s. We're already transitioning to that now. And what do I mean by that? If you think what's happening in Ukraine, I think that's doubled down on what we're doing with the Commando force is exactly the right thing. Small teams, light footprint, light signature, new technologies, the ability to operate at pace. That's exactly built into the Commando force thinking. So we're going to invest not far off £1 billion this decade on Commando forces. And we're going to do it iteratively. And increasingly, we're going to have to put new capabilities in the hands of Marines forward and get them to see how it works, and we'll adjust from there. So you will see in the next couple of years increased numbers of drones in our littoral response groups. Yes, of course, initially they will be relatively small, but pretty quickly we'll be moving stuff around a task group at sea and to the shore and back again. So that gives you, I hope, a sense of how we're going to take the people we've got, innovate as much as we can. The bets will be working out where we scale up, because we're not going to scale everything up. That's unrealistic. But where we see a genuine advantage, that's where we're going to go after.
Right, let's take some of your questions that are coming in. And Robert Streeter has wants to ask you about the Chief of Defence Staff. And obviously having a CDS who heralds from the same parish presumably is an advantage. It's a great thing. But obviously he knows how it works. Just tell us from your experience a little bit about that dynamic, and how is having an admiral as CDS helping get a strategy together for the 2030s, not just implementing the things that he did when he was 1SL.
So I used to work a few years back as a principal staff officer to the Chief of Defence. So I know what it's like in the Chief of Defence Staff's office. And we've had 2 decades where there have been largely Army generals, but a couple of Air Chief Marshals as well as Chief of Defence. So on one level, I'm really pleased we've got an Admiral as Chief of Defence, because the campaigns in Afghanistan are very much behind us now. These are different sets of global problems, and I think to have a different perspective in the Chief of Defence Staff is really good news. But of course, that keeps us on our toes, because Admiral Tony he's been Second Sea Lord, he's been First Sea Lord, and he's very keen that we carry on that level of ambition that he talked about when he was First Sea Lord. So
how does this work? Does he WhatsApp you on a Sunday night and say, come on, Martin, we need a bit more here or there. Or
He used to when he was First Sea Lord.
he did when he was
I think
first,
he's got other
right?
things on his mind. But yeah, he speaks to the First Sea Lord regularly. He's always gracious enough when I'm in MOD. If I pass him in the corridor, he always pulls me aside for a chat and asking, how's such going? He's got a remarkable capacity and interest in what we're doing, which is really good news. I'd much rather have that than a Chief of Defence who frankly wasn't interested in what the Navy's up to. And there have been occasions in years gone past where the First Sea Lord of the Day has struggled to get a bit of traction on issues. So the opportunity now for us is to articulate that compelling vision that I talked about. And I think what we can expect in this CDS is someone who sat in head office can help us unblock some of the issues. And occasionally there are blockers that are there. Instinctively he'll understand those, and he should be able to help us, and he said as much, he wants to. So I look forward to that.
Great. Alistair Adair has got a question about the role of the reserves. And, how do you see the reserves making, an enhanced contribution to, more available, attract people in high-tech careers, that type of thing?
So the reserves are really important. They are a relatively small part of the overall whole force. And of course, we're talking about Royal Navy Reserve and Royal Marine Reserve. We're changing the way we train Royal Marine Reserves. That'll happen over the next year or so. But there's the age-old issue with reserves, which is, are they there to provide niche roles, or are they there to provide a degree of capacity? And the answer, I think, is both. I was really pleased during the pandemic that a number of reserves stepped up and filled critical roles at a really challenging time. And I think that's a really important test for any reserves. When a crisis comes along, where are they? And they were there. And about 20% of them stepped up into roles. And that's quite remarkable for a relatively small cadre. But what we want to do is modernise further so that there are certain skill sets that we can bring in to our reserves. And the opportunities there in artificial intelligence, autonomous data, software engineers. I think we can provide a different offer.
But is the system, sufficiently bright, intelligent to pick that out? I mean, last year I met a reserve midshipman at Dartmouth, and I asked him casually what he does in his day job, and he said, "Well, I'm working for NASA on the sort of manned mission to Mars." And I thought, are you having me on? Are you pulling my leg, or is that for real? And it's for real. So we have people with amazing skills, but I'm not sure the reserves organisation or the Navy more widely knows that there are people doing that type of work that we can. How can we harness that more systematically?
We've got a broad range of backgrounds for people in our reserves, and I think it is a good challenge to how we can harness it and how we can leverage off better. But let me give you a couple of examples. We're opening in Portsmouth an operational advantage centre and a new warfighting centre. We're going to move our commando forces and co-locate. We're going to do thinking on synthetic environments and a sort of naval battle lab, if you like, in Portsmouth. That is perfectly placed to co-locate and work with some of the reserves in and around the Portsmouth area. So I would expect them to come in and enable that. And that's an opportunity they perhaps haven't had in the past. So I think it's a fair challenge for us, but we're up to that.
Okay. I've got a question from a welfare officer in District 3, not quite sure where that is, Tom Ujan, who is basically asking about the pay gap. I mean, how do you intend to bridge the pay gap between the Navy and the private sector? I mean, presumably you can never do that.
No, I don't think we can act independently to reflect short-term changes. There's the Armed Forces Pay Review Body, which is tasked to go and conduct all sorts of research, speaking directly with our people, so that they can give an independent assessment to the government of the day over what the pay ought to be for our people. But it isn't just about the pay that they get at the end of the month. It's about the entirety of the offer. And that, of course, gives them job security, it gives them medical support, it gives them fantastic access to sport and other facilities. So when you monetize those, as indeed many private sector companies will do, then if you add on some pension benefits, and then if you add on some of the cost of living issues in terms of helping with some accommodation, we're not perfect in all of this, but it's quite a competitive offer then. If you just take a simple, here's your salary, then, as I said earlier, there will be other industries certainly that can compete much more favourably in that regard. But I think it's the entirety of the offer and the variety and the fulfilling nature of the work. But I'm not going to belittle the fact that many of our people are finding it difficult in terms of cost of living. They are. I've spoken to a number of families recently, particularly those who have a number of young children. It is really tough for them. Look at, obviously, cost of energy is going up exponentially right now. They're finding that really difficult to reconcile that. So I would hope that the Armed Forces Pay Review Body take all of that into account, as indeed the government will.
I've got a follow-up question in the same area from Pete Sanderman, who runs a very good website called Navy Lookout. And he says, Admiral, are you really confident that the Navy can retain enough SQEP to deliver the vision, especially marine engineers? Can you share or talk about any specific new initiatives to aid retention?
So it's going to be tough retaining certain niche cadres. As I said earlier, that we can take people with relatively modest academic qualifications and give them transferable skills that they can use to go back into society. Engineers is a classic example. And whether it's a marine engineer for ships or indeed submarines, we are short in certain ranks and rates right now, and I'm watching those statistics really closely. But if you look at a nuclear engineer, there's nothing stopping me saying, well, you can leave and go and work in a power station and to be a watchkeeper there. I know for a fact that that will not be the exciting role that they have currently. So what we've got to try and do is, first of all, recognise that they have skills that are in high demand. We've got to be, I think, much more willing to engage with people on a one-to-one basis, rather than take it or leave it. It's got to be more about what would keep you in a few more years. And it might be something as simple as, well, my partner's career is at a critical point, I'd just like a bit of domestic stability for a few years. Well, we might be able to offer that. So I think we've got to be much smarter at retaining people at the right time in their careers, listening to what matters to them. And I keep coming back to the fact that it is a dynamic offer. I think it's an exciting offer. But yes, we need to grow the number of engineers over this next decade. That means retaining people, particularly if they're experienced, and it means recruiting more people, and we're doing both.
Please keep your questions coming. I'll try and get to as many of them as I can. We've got one here from the Naval Review, recently relaunched, I think, which says, thank you so much for talking to us this evening. There's a well-known saying, recruit the person, retain the family. And the question is, what can the RN do to better retain the family when so many of the levers that make up the offer, for example, accommodation and pay, are not in the RN's direct control?
Well, one of my roles is I work very closely with my tri-service colleagues on the things that span across defence. So I work closely with the Chief of Defence People on some of those cross-cutting issues. So if you think of the future accommodation model, this is about that. An important part of the offer is how we help people live. And it's slightly different if you're in the Army, to the Air Force, to the Navy. So I want to give people more choice. Most people I speak to who want to stay in the Navy for a career want at a suitable point to get on the housing ladder. Not everyone, but a significant number do. So I don't want the offer in the future to be as binary as we can find you a quarter to live in or you're on your own, Jack. I want it to be, what do you want? well, if you want to get on the housing ladder, why don't we help you with that? So the future accommodation model is piloting a few different initiatives right now. It'll come into force in the next couple of years, and I hope it will give people that want stability access to quarters, that want and are mobile, the ability to move around, that want to buy their own place, a helping hand with that. It's got to be able to do all of those things, I think, as well as provide value money for defence. So I work behind the scenes with my tri-service colleagues to make sure those programmes, when they do come in, work.
Charles Brosnan wants to know about forward operating vessels. And he knows from his own personal experience with FIPV just how complicated the logistical problems can be. Even basic items are difficult to receive in a timely manner. Given what's being invested in forward deployed capabilities, that's now such a big bit of what we're doing, what you're delivering.
Right.
How are we getting that logistical piece right?
So I want forward deployment to be more the norm than the exception. And the exception is where it was before. But that said, we have got experience of doing this. It is 15 years since we had MCMVs, mine countermeasure vessels, in and around the Gulf. HMS Montrose has done a fantastic job in the Gulf, forward deployed, and we've changed the crewing model. We've hosted that in the Gulf. We've made adjustments to some of the support facilities, particularly in Bahrain, but not entirely Bahrain. And HMS Lancaster, which I'm going to visit tomorrow morning, by the way, will be the next ship to deploy to take over from Montrose and will be forward deployed as well. We very quickly deployed the 5 Batch 2 offshore patrol vessels. They were not built specifically to operate globally, but we looked at how we could do that, and I thought pretty quickly we've deployed those ships globally, and I don't think there's a need for them to come back to the UK. Now, they might come back periodically because we might choose to bring them back, but fundamentally they are forward deployed.
It's a really efficient way of doing it. You're getting, for the investment
it
and
is,
the
as
capability.
long as we think through all those lines of development you mentioned. So I mentioned the integrated plan, and on one level it's pretty dull. People go, God, second signal's going on, it's integrated plan. Let me just bring to life what that means. Type 31 is in build right now. In just a few years' time, by 2027, I want the first Type 31 to be deployed globally, wherever the government of the day chooses it to be. But to do that, it won't happen by chance. We've got to make decisions now, in fact, by the end of this year, about the support solution that will enable a forward deployed Type 31. We've got to make decisions at the end of this year about the training required. We've got to make decisions within the next year or so about the crewing solution. And there are various different crewing options available. It's not just one size fits all. There are a whole blend of different options. So that when we do deploy that first Type 31, we've got all those building blocks in place.
I mean, a related question from John Bartlett about RFAs. You want to increase the size of the fleet. Does that mean we need to build up the RFAs as well?
Well, we've got some fantastic ships and people within the RFA, but it's not as big as it was before. So we need to get what we have got, we need to make really good use of. We're going to run on a couple of ships well beyond their design life, but we can do that. We're going to, at the same time, we're at a critical stage of the FSS program, and hopefully soon we will decide which of the bidders wins that one. So, you know, we've got good ships in service, we've got great people, and we've got new ships and new programs coming online, and we're also going to bring in online, I hope, other capabilities that will be under the RFA ensign as well.
And is FSS on time, on budget, all going to happen? Abbey Wood delivering for you?
Well, the FSS program, if I go back to my previous role leading Defence Carrier Strike, I would have wanted...
Let's just explain what FSS, for those that
yeah,
don't
Fleet
know.
Solid
This
Support
is
Ship.
critical for the
It
carriers.
It is. So Fleet Solid Support Ship, if you go back, we've been designing the Carrier Strike program for the best part of a couple of decades. And the key constituent parts were the Queen Elizabeth class carriers and the F-35 jets. But clearly Carrier Strike is much more than just that. And as a Navy, we've been making sure that everything that enables a Carrier Strike capability is properly thought through. And it's fine for initial capability. But the ability to self-sustain a carrier strike group globally is dependent on having the organic capacity to sail with the operational stock, bombs and bullets, as well as stores, as well as endurance, fuel, food, and it needs to go with the task group. So we're using Fort Victoria, that's an old girl in ship terms right now. She's doing a great job, but she's not going to last forever. So the Fleet Solid Support Ship program, I want to deliver so that we can finally put Fort Victoria to extended readiness and bring these new ships in that will be more available. They'll be more flexible and adaptable at how we move kit, bombs, bullets in and around a task group.
And where will they be built?
That depends on the competition. So we're getting a critical phase now, and I think the fact the Secretary of State is the shipbuilding SAR means that he will pay very close attention to all aspects of that programme.
Because the UK industrial capacity for this is quite limited, isn't it? So is there still a question about whether some of these get built overseas?
I think it's fair to say you can't turn that on overnight and have a programme like that having 100% everything onshore sovereign. But it's the challenge that's been set there is how much of it can we have? And that's I'm straying into areas I shouldn't really go into, so I'm going to pause there. But it's at a critical phase. I think it's quite an exciting phase, and I need it to deliver.
I should have asked Chris Gardner that question when he was
done.
here a few months ago. Lots of questions coming in. I've got one from Julie Martin. 50% of the future workforce are women. What is the RN doing to attract and retain more women?
So the Navy's had on or around 10% of our regular workforce have been women for, well, as long as I can remember, certainly the last decade. And that's not good enough. So I have set about increasing the number of women within the Navy. And this is not just about doing it because it's societally the right thing to do. It's about the skill sets they can bring that we haven't got within the male workforce. So, but that's challenging across society, whereby about 11 to 12% of the nation's engineers are women, and about half the Royal Navy are engineers of one sort or another. So I've got to, once again, for those women who decide they want a career in engineering, appeal and say, we can offer you a really exciting career. And importantly, the expressions of interest by women in the Royal Navy has gone up in the last 12 months. So I want to turn those expressions of interest into people that appear in the trained strength. And we've put together a small team that can track those expressions of interest and bring them through. But, I'm not complacent here. 10% is not enough. And I think a modern Royal Navy it should be 15%. So I've set that target of my team in the next 2 years. We will have a plan to get to 15%.
Well, we'll add that to your legacy scorecard at the end.
That's fair.
I've got a question from one of your fellow honorary officers, Paul Little, who says that thank you very much for direct and honest answers, which is good. So hopefully we're doing something right here, Paul. But he wants to know about how the Royal Navy could work even more closely with the UK Merchant Navy. Paul obviously has just taken on this new role in the shipbuilding area. Are we getting that right? Is there more that we can do?
Well, I commend Paul for stepping forward there. If you look at skills across the UK, we're an island nation. We should have an abundance of skills from all sorts of the maritime sector. And the harsh truth is we haven't. So what we've got to do is work in a joined up way across all sectors, particularly civil and defence. And we've got to work in a more joined up way on nuclear, as well as more traditional shipbuilding and ship integration sort of skills. And that's going to be a real challenge, because it can't just be left to industry to build an academy or left to our universities. We've got to do this in a really joined up way, and we've got to do it at pace as well. And it's got to reflect the entire United Kingdom. So I know Paul's got his work cut out. We're going to work really closely with him and others. But I think it should appeal, I hope, as universities, so I've spoken to a few, industry I speak to quite regularly about this. There's a common opportunity now for us to work collaboratively on this. And again, perhaps add it to my balanced scorecard in a few years' time. But I think it's critical we get that right.
I just wanted to spend the last part of this conversation looking at world events. And I mean, so much is happening. I mean, there's sort of 2 decades worth of change happening in 2 years. But we've got a Ukrainian flag on our table here this evening. Obviously, we are watching these events very, very closely, and you and your colleagues, the UK contribution to this is critical. I mean, what are we learning? Are there a series of re-evaluations that need to take place across UK armed services, but also particularly in the Navy as we look at the Black Sea experience? What are we figuring out that we're going to need to do differently? And I'd then like to come on just to our approach to the Black Sea specifically, but just overall, big rethink?
I don't think it's a big rethink. In fact, the integrated review said that return to state and state conflict. Indeed, we're seeing that writ large right now. I think we're learning quite a lot about how the Russians are performing. And I mentioned about Commando forces. It's really important that speed of decision making in modern warfare is not entirely hierarchical. I mean, I genuinely think it was quite farcical seeing a Russian general with a magnifying glass on a laptop trying to look at, that is not how you control the modern battlefield. You've got to set the conditions, enable capabilities to be deployed forward, and be able to make strategic and operational decisions at pace. So I think those sort of lessons we are seeing. We're also seeing the critical importance of alliances, and we talk about this in peacetime and tend not to, it can often be rather glib. Yet when you shift to a crisis, it's absolutely critical. And the UK Armed Forces have trained over 20,000 of our Ukrainian Armed Forces colleagues over the last 5 or 6 years. So we've not gone from a standing start. That means that some relationships have been built up, which has proven to be really important. And then we've responded, I think, in a pretty joined up way, and over £750 million worth of support has been provided from defence to the Ukrainians. So in that respect, what that's telling me is if we can provide that level of quick turnaround and put capability on the ground, perhaps we can do some of that ourselves in our own acquisition here, which in some cases is too slow. So there are those sort of lessons we can play back to ourselves. And then there are the challenging issues that I think it's not just defence that's seeing, which is how can you mobilise the supply chain quickly. So it's causing us to think very carefully and reflect on that as well.
The Black Sea now is proving to be strategically vital, and there's a war for grain taking place, and there are many who say, look, it is time for NATO and other allies to create a corridor, a safe passage to allow vital food and materials both to get to Ukraine, but vitally to get these grain supplies out. Is there a case? It's not like a no-fly zone. These are international waters, part of it. Is there a case for direct intervention to clear the mines, to create a corridor? After all, this time last year, I think HMS Defender was in the Black Sea. The famous Crimea incident with Defender last June. So this is familiar territory for us, isn't it?
Well, it shows the importance of access to, and I think at times we can take for granted how things get on supermarket shelves. And it's been quite educational, once again, that a disruption to a global supply chain results in and manifests in costs going up and gaps on shelves. And that can even be here in the UK, as we're seeing. But yes, nations that are absolutely dependent upon that, there has to be an alternative, or they will go seeking support elsewhere. And I think the international community has to watch that, particularly those African Union nations who will only have so much strategic patience So there's that aspect. And I think in terms of the operational aspect, which is access to the Black Sea, and Black Sea is a challenging sea to operate in because of the proximity to a conflict in this case. It won't be the UK acting independently. We will do so clearly with an international effort and endeavour. And I know that my colleague, the Chief of Joint Operations, is looking at contingency options for just that.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's probably one of those issues where, you know, time is not on anybody's side. And, you know, if there is going to be some action, some intervention that's going to make a difference, it probably needs to be soon. Maybe you'll have that discussion at the Admiralty Board next week.
Maybe we will, yeah.
Look, in the final few minutes, and thank you very much for all of your questions, and sorry if we didn't get to every one. But I just want to turn to where we started with the Royal Navy and Royal Marines charity. I mean, you've been a great friend of the charity. And I mean, it you know, from where I sit outside, it seems to do extraordinary work. But I wonder whether you could just tell us how much it means to the serving community, and whether there's a shout out to the charity for something they should do that perhaps they're not doing.
It sits within my portfolio that I have the lead for interfacing across the charities sector, the naval facing charities anyway. And I've made it a priority in my first 6 months to get around and speak to those that work day to day in the charities, as well as the trustees, and in some cases the advisors of those charities as well. So I think I've got a pretty good feel for it. And the message I've said is, one, thank you for stepping up during COVID, because we had to carry on delivering as a Navy, and we asked an extraordinary amount of our people during that time. And I was really pleased with the speed with which risk was taken to provide resource where it was needed and support where it was needed. And you know, I think it's important that that's recognised by trustees of those charities, in particular RNRMC, who I know did a great job. I also want to make sure that we're more joined up across the charitable sector. There are many different charities out there that do some brilliant work, but at times they're not as joined up as they could be. And I think everyone has accepted that challenge. Nobody has pushed back and said, no, we're special, we're only going to work in a certain sort of way. Because if we work more joined up across those naval-facing charities, then we'll have better outcomes for the beneficiaries. And put simply, that's not just about the sailors and Marines who are serving today. You touched on their families, that's really important part of this. And you know, I've been a trustee of the Naval Children's Charity for many years, who do some excellent work behind the scenes, supporting children and families who stumble upon hard times all of a sudden. And then it's the veterans community. And you don't have to serve very long at all to be classified a veteran. And you never know when you might be in need. So it's important that we put a light on that and show some of the excellent work that's being done. So I applaud everybody who has stepped up these last few years, and I look forward to working with them all in the years ahead.
That's good to know. Thank you. And thank you for your support of the charity. Finally, you're also president of Royal Navy Football.
Excellent, yes.
How's the season going?
It could have been better. And that's the great thing with football. You reflect back on the season and think, oh well, there's the next season's just around the corner. And what was really impressive this year was the under-23 development squad. They play some attractive football, and I've got high hopes that they will play through into the senior team pretty soon. And also, I saw the women play at Portsmouth, and that was a level of women's football I have not seen before. It was brilliant to watch. And the challenge to the male football squad is, I found that women's game more entertaining than the Army-Navy male game. Now, I'll get lots of feedback for that, but I genuinely mean it. So it's an exciting time for football as well.
Okay, well, you heard that here first. Admiral Martin, thank you very much for making yourself available for this chat. I hope everybody's enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much for putting in your questions. We'll be back in a couple of months. Haven't quite decided who we'll ask to come into the hot chair. Maybe we should ask Admiral Tony. It would be good to have CDS with us. So if he's watching, consider that to be an invitation. Thank you very much. Have a good evening, and thank you for supporting the Royal Navy Royal Marines charity. Cheerio.
Thanks, Stephen.